Welcome to WaterColor Exercise 2. In this video, you're going to practice a couple more techniques using the large mop brush. And the techniques that we're going to cover are wet and wet, lifting and blotting, and Drybrush as well. But first we're going to use the mop brush, which is a large brush, and it's usually primarily used without color, and it's used to lay down a large amount of water on the paper to pre-wet it. And so this is where the wet and wet method comes in. And so I'm going to be using the mop brush first with some clean water, and then a smaller brush with the color. And if you want to test out, before you do this on the big paper, if you want to test it out on a smaller sheet to see how it works, you could do that. For the paper today, I'm using a more heavyweight paper, and I've got it taped down to the board on all four sides, and this will help keep the paper from buckling from the amount of water that we're going to put on it, which is quite a lot. So I'm going to start just by wetting. I'm going to soak one side of the page with the mop brush, and you just spread the water on the page, and I'm going to do about half of it, partially because it's easier to control a smaller area, and the other reason is because with wet and wet, where you soak the paper is only where the color is going to go. The water will act as kind of a barrier. So now, when I spread the pigment on the paper, I've already got this wet surface, and you can see that a gradient. It's really easy to make that gradient. So the gradient that we created in exercise 1, where you were adding more water from the brush, is a little bit more laborious than it is here, because here the water does the work for you because the paper's already wet. You can add to this wet and wet area so long as the paper's still wet. Once the paint starts to dry, if you go back and you add more, you might get what are called blooms, where the new area will spread into the old area, and it makes these kind of ugly barriers. So try to do all your painting in sort of one go before it dries, or before it starts to dry. I've got a bit of a sharp edge over here, so I can just use I can use just a clean brush to sort of sweep that away. And I don't have a paper towel, but I would really like a paper towel right here. I'm just going to use my hand and just clean that edge up like that. So, all right, that's one side. So let's do the other side. Combine colors within your gradient. So now I've got a one color gradient on this side, and I've got a two color gradient on this side. I've got a hair in there. Let's get that out of there. All right, and you could even do 3 or 4 color gradients within your wet and wet zone if you want to. All right, so that is the first technique. That's the wet and wet. And then I'm going to wait for this to dry, and then I'll come back and do the lifting and blotting, a little bit more wet and wet, and then maybe I'll throw a dry brush in there too. Okay, so this is the next part of exercise 2. where I'm going to show you guys lifting and blotting and also some dry brush. Before we get into that, we can look at this area here where I've got some blooming, and that is where a wet area kind of washed into an area that was already a little bit dry. I didn't think that I did that. I was working pretty quickly, but it can still happen. So you can use lift. So actually, this is kind of an example of lifting, that with a wet brush, with a clean wet brush, you can just gently soften that bloom line. And if you do it carefully and without too much pressure, you can kind of work it back in. It's never quite going to be the same. You can see that when I'm lifting here, and lifting is where you take a clean brush, you go back over an old area. You can see that where I'm lifting, the page is starting to turn a little bit white. So why don't we try to cover that area by doing some more lifting. And for this, I really want to get all the paint, or as much paint up as I can. So I'm actually going to use an acrylic brush for this. Something with well, it's acrylic oil. This is one of the blue handle acrylic and oil brushes. And what I want to do now is I want to lift this paint completely. So I'm going to start by really digging into it here and really pushing at the paint that's there. And then when you're ready, you can blot it. So that's the blotting. And you can do this several times. And the more water you add, the more you can remove from the paper. So now I've got a clean area to work. So I've done some more blotting now and removed a few more areas and shapes. There's two ways that you can work with the blotting. One way is, or with the lifting and blotting, one way is to do the way I showed you before, where you lift it and you blot away the water. And another way is you can lift and you can add water, and then you can go and you can do some wet and wet inside of that area. So I'm kind of going for sort of a futuristic landscape here. So this area here is wet, so because it's wet, I can now use the water that's in the wet section to create some little cloud shapes, some shadows. This is some shadows on some clouds. And you can blot as the water starts to spread. You can blot with your paper towel to control the bleeding. Down here I lifted and blotted, and then these shapes up here I lifted and blotted. So I'm going to do a little hillscape down at the bottom. Because I removed some of the paint from the bottom.
That girl made up please do good things. You literally tracked him down, and you scheduled out his where he walked in the hallway.
Bye, thank you.
Next, I'm going to do these round shapes in the sky up here. And I was kind of going for a Tatooine double sun kind of thing. Add some water back in to this area. And then let that kind of fill in. should stay in that little spot because it was all dry around it, and I added water to that section, and so the paint should stay there. And I'll do a red sun next to it. So I've got an orange sun and a red sun. I mean, you can do whatever you want for this. You know, it doesn't have to be a landscape. It could be just abstract shapes. As long as you're applying the wet and wet, lifting and blotting, and then I'm going to show you guys dry brush at the end. So 3 techniques in total. That red was too strong, so I gotta tone it down a bit. All right, there we go. Last part, and this will be the dry brush. So dry brush is exactly what it sounds like, a dry brush. So you don't dip your brush into the water first. You have to make sure that the brush is dry. And by dry, like not use that day. If it's wet at all, this technique's not gonna work. So have the color ready that you want to use. So in this case, I want to do some tree kind of textured tree shapes at the bottom. So have the color ready that you want to use. So I'm gonna mix it first using a brush that I already got wet. So I'm gonna get the color going, and I want like a dark green for this, like a really dark green. All right, so I've got the color that I want, and now I've got the dry brush, and just take the tips of the bristles and just dab it into the edge of the paint so that you don't have a lot of paint in your brush. And the reason why this works is because the brush is not saturated, and so you're going to get like these really sort of scratchy marks. Sometimes when you first dip it in the paint, it's too saturated. So if you just paint kind of out on the edge somewhere to get the excess water out of there, and then as you paint, you're not going to get a smooth line. You're going to get a very rough look. And this is really good for foliage, hair, pet fur, anything that has like a rough, scratchy texture or a natural texture. So I'm using it kind of just for these trees on the hillside, and then I can also kind of use it for maybe some kind of suggestion of grass down here. Again, a stiffer brush is better for dry brush. So one of the tempera or acrylic or oil brushes that is clean and dry is going to be the best for this. The soft hair brushes that we're using for watercolor are not as good for dry brush. They're just kind of too soft and floppy. Alright, so that is wet and wet, lifting and blotting, and dry brush all in the same demo. Play around with those techniques, do something fun with them, something creative to expand your technical ability of watercolor.